Hello and welcome to the Voiro Podcast, where we do a weekend review of everything in the world of advertising, streaming, monetization, and the internet at large. With me this week is my colleague Rohan Rangaswami.
Hi, morning.
Good morning, Rohan. Kavita is traveling and is not with us this week, so you have some pretty big shoes to fill. I am very excited to have Rohan with us today, given the fact that he promises to have a very interesting perspective on today's primary topic. Now, Rohan, across his career, has spent time in consulting, in marketing, in finance, and is now the Chief Revenue Officer of Voiro and helping organizations manage and optimize ad revenue. And today, I wanted to spend some time talking about one of my favorite companies, Netflix.
Yeah. It's exciting. Netflix, $65 CPM Advertising.
That's right.
It's the headline that's dominated a large part of the advertising world, I want to say, for the last week or so. I think reactions have ranged from everything from horror to wondering where this is going to go and whether it's going to absolutely explode.
That's right. So the Wall Street Journal broke a story this week about the fact that Netflix was potentially going to charge sky-high prices for ads to show on their platform. And just for a little context, Netflix has been in the news pretty much all of 2022 because the most innovative company of our time, or one of the most innovative companies of our time, has been sailing through some choppy waters, shall we say, with their stock price and their loss of subscribers and the need for them to reinvent themselves a little bit. And this week, the Wall Street Journal uncovered this story because they spoke to a few ad buyers as well as Microsoft, who's Netflix advertising partner, who put this data point out in the public domain. A little known event also took place this week, which is Netflix's TUDUM event, which is their content showcase and their fan event. So safe to say that Netflix was all over my news feed this week. Now, through the course of this year, Netflix and Reed Hastings announced the fact that they are going to launch an ad-supported model. And everyone's been talking about what that's going to look like. Is it going to ruin the experience? Are we going to cannibalize users? What's it going to cost? And what does that mean for everybody? Consumers, advertisers, content creators, Hollywood, everyone who is now used to the model that Netflix has created. And very interestingly, this data point is accompanied by a couple of other constraints that advertisers might have to adhere to. And I wanted to know what your early reactions are to the number itself and what went on in your mind.
Yeah, so the number itself was large enough to be shocking to almost everyone that read it, right, to begin with. I think the most frequently quoted comparison over the last week has been Super Bowl, right, which runs at CPMs of about $55, right? And it is probably the most premium advertising property in the world. And Netflix is now a good 20% higher than that, right? Just for the sake of people who are listening who don't know what a CPM is, right? It's the cost per 1,000 impressions, right? Or the cost, or what it costs an advertiser to buy 1,000 impressions or views of that particular.
Get your ad to be seen 1,000
Get your
times.
ad to be seen 1,000 times, right? So the first reaction I think was shock, right? Is Netflix out of their minds, right? What's going on here? Is this doomed to fail before it started? And I think as the week has gone on, there've been a few other interesting questions that have got raised, right? Netflix has always defined themselves as the most premium property in their space, right? And well, a price like this kind of goes hand in hand with that, right? But like you said, they've put other constraints on this model as well, right? They've talked about advertisers not being able to verify their impressions via third-party trackers. Netflix's audience on a relative scale is pretty small, right? So while their prices are expensive, is this really going to make a dent in the business problems that they have? Is advertising going to become a large enough and relevant enough business for them, right? There's a bunch of questions that are floating around this whole, this whole business model of theirs. And it's going to be interesting to see how it pans out as some of these details get confirmed.
Yeah. If you look at the history of Netflix, I think they have always been known for swimming against the tide, putting one bombshell after the other out in the market. There's a very nice podcast called The Land of the Giants, which spends every season talking about one big tech company. And I've loved Peter Kafka and his podcast for many months now, but I especially liked this series. And they did an entire season about Netflix, their history, how they came about, how they made streaming a thing, even though they did not invent streaming as a concept. But if you trace the history of Netflix, there have always been challenges in front of them, and they have always pulled something out of the hat. And my initial reaction was, is this the start of something that the world does not expect to see, which is why everyone's getting shocked? They launched streaming when everyone was talking about DVDs. They started to create original content when everyone was trying to figure out how to acquire content from big media. They created a business model that Wall Street loved so much that every big tech and big media company decided that that was the way of the future because consumers loved it. Even though today it is proving to be a model that in itself is not as viable as people thought. Even on a smaller scale, Netflix launched an offline mode in countries like India, where there are a billion TV lovers, but the affordability of devices, of televisions, of streaming platforms is low, and a lot of people prefer to download their movies and then watch them on the go when they're outdoors. Netflix has also been known for some funky accounting practices, which leaves a lot to be addressed or understood in terms of how they spend money on original content. So in many ways, they have been a company of several firsts. And what I'm curious to know is, this could be another one of those.
It could be another one, right? I think one thing that's safe to say is that every time Netflix has taken on a new business or a new challenge, they've done well out of it, right? It's very rare that you see Netflix going into something and coming out of it not having achieved what they want to, right? I think the difference between this one and a lot of the previous products that they've announced is that this one has been really public. Almost everything else that Netflix has stepped into, they've just launched it, right? And it's been up to the world to use it and enjoy it or not and kind of react from there.
Yeah.
This is an instance where we're getting a lot of the reaction before the product's even launched, right? And there's bound to be speculation, especially with a company the size of Netflix.
Yeah, well, the world is full of pundits.
The world is full of pundits,
Like
right?
us.
And like two of us, yeah. But if I had to place a bet, I wouldn't bet against Netflix, right? At least not in the long term. I think if you look at this question a year from now, I think there's going to be mixed results. You're going to have people who say it was a colossal failure and it's diluted Netflix's experience and so on. And on the other side, I do firmly believe that something in what Netflix does is going to change the way online video is sold, right? I do believe that. Yeah.
I would completely agree. In fact, one of the things I've been wondering about over the last few months is a lot of narratives about portions of our industry, whether it's CTV or data-driven TV or fast. There are a lot of narratives that I think must be viewed with a US-centric lens and then a global lens.
Yeah.
A $65 CPM for me is a very US-centric
A
metric.
$65 CPM is a very US-centric lens. But the kind of the low-cost tier that's going to be the audience for the $65 CPM is not targeted at the US.
Exactly.
Right? So that's an interesting kind of contradiction, and I'm really curious to see where
It's
they go
either
with
a
that.
contradiction, or if you think about how this metric made it to the public domain, this is a leaked number blown out of proportion.
Sure.
Right? Netflix, I'm sure, even if you look at the history of their pricing as a product, they launched in the US. Then they launched many tiers in the US because you had at one point only DVDs, and then you had DVD plus streaming, then you had only streaming. Then they took it to other countries where they quickly realized that the price point didn't hold. So then they brought it down. We've lived through that in India. I've been a Netflix subscriber in the US as well as India, so I've been able to witness both data points, although I mooch off of my wife's Netflix account today. But even in India, they were able to quickly adapt, and they even launched a mobile-only subscription tier, which was a little lower. I suspect this is the start of a data point that we are going to expect to see, which is what are their CPMs in the US, and therefore what is the price of the ad-supported tier in the US. And there will be equivalent models that come up across the world. And like you rightly said, I would not bet against that.
Yeah, and Netflix being as public and visible a company as it is, right? There's going to be a lot of interrogation into these numbers once they are finally reported.
Yeah.
Like I would expect that analysts all over the world are going to dig deeply into Netflix's CPM numbers the first quarter after they launch this business, right? And there are going to be comparisons made about India versus the US, and these are data points that are not, I would say, freely available in the market,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
How expensive is America compared to India as far as an eyeball is concerned?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And not just India, even if you look at Europe or Africa,
Yeah.
you were telling me about an interesting conversation you had last week about the European market having such rich public broadcast networks and systems that AVOD is not even a
AVOD is not a huge thing there. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
because between bundled subscription products and publicly offered products, everyone kind of has content at their fingertips without
Right.
needing
Right.
without needing to pay too much extra
Yeah.
for it. Yeah.
A lot of countries in Africa have a very different problem. While they made advancements in payment systems and several other pieces of technology over the last few years, linear still is very, very popular and commands a lot of eyeballs in Africa. Streaming has not taken off to the extent that it has in other parts of the world. Bob Iger, from the ex-Disney CEO, recently made a fairly controversial statement where he said, we are witnessing the death of linear TV. And of course, everyone we know who has products that are betting on the FAST ecosystem came out of the woodworks and said, this is why FAST is needed, because it's going to save linear television. Now, I'm not sure. Netflix has a surprise me option, which some would consider fast, but until it's actually ad supported, you can't. The A in fast is missing. Yeah. But I do believe that Netflix will innovate even within the ad supported model.
Yeah.
AVOD, fast. I'm very curious to know what they do about originals, because I think that is the one thing where they over indexed and spent a lot of money, and that is proving to be tough from an economic standpoint.
Yeah. It's. These are all questions that are up in the air. I do firmly believe that the business model that we're hearing about today in terms of CPMs and the audience size is not going to save them from the financial pressure that they're under. They're going to have to do more. And knowing Netflix, they will, and they'll do it soon.
Yeah.
Right. But I'm really curious to see where that goes.
Yeah. You were talking to me as someone who has worn a marketer's hat about how advertisers will have to up their game because of Netflix's premiumness, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, so Netflix, like I said, they've always considered themselves to be a premium, top quality product, right? So if you look at advertising from two lenses, from their own lens, right, which is they don't want to see ads, they don't want to create an ad experience in their product that ruins the rest of their streaming experience, right? That's going to be front and center for them.
Yeah.
Right. And on the advertiser side, right, that means advertisers are going to really have to up their game in terms of the kind of creatives they put on the platform, right? I cannot imagine that, a 6-second video that you see on YouTube today is going to be effective or will look, native in Netflix's interface. That just seems really alien to me.
Yeah.
So certainly I think Netflix is going to kind of be self-selective to only a small group of advertisers. I think those advertisers are really going to have to up their game as far as their creative are concerned, creative formats, what they look for out of the ads.
Yeah.
Right. I can't imagine that Netflix is going to let people take actions on the app that drive them outside the app. Right. So this is going to be kind of a view-only ad. I don't know what action is going to be possible at the end of it. And advertisers are going to have to be really intelligent, I would say, to have to be able to get $65 or more of value out of out of the ads that they put there. Yeah.
It is purported that the first ad we see on Netflix is going to be 2 months from today.
Yeah.
Or less than that.
Yeah.
Sometime in November, I'm told. And I'd be very curious to know who that initial set of advertisers are.
My bet would be it's going to be people like Apple, right? And the like.
Yeah.
Like people whose ads, A, look great to begin with.
Yeah.
Right? B, no Apple ad ever wants you to buy a product there and then.
Yeah.
Right? It's only about branding.
Yeah.
Right? They don't expect you to take an action. Right? So to me, this is the kind of product that's going to succeed on Netflix, at least in the early days. And beyond that, we'll have to take it as it comes. But I would expect that you're going to have a class of advertisers that evolve their advertising to kind of be more suitable for this platform.
That's going to be interesting to watch because this set of parameters is not going to change dramatically, right? So Netflix, I think, is always going to keep that premium status. Like you said, relatively speaking, the subscriber base isn't as large. It's 220 million, something like that. If I'm not, I might have.
It's in the ballpark, and it's only a small fraction of that that's actually going to be seeing the ads.
Right, exactly. Now, branding campaigns, advertisers who don't look for performant advertising units or ad spots are typically going to look for reach.
Yeah.
So this is already a little bit of a contradiction
Yep.
here. So you're now saying it's a premium platform for premium advertisers looking to talk to premium users,
Yes.
but using reach-based campaigns. And it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves, because the whole point of moving to an ad-supported model is to cater to an audience that maybe is less premium in some sense.
Yep.
I'm very intrigued by how this contradiction solves itself.
Yeah. And you talked about reach, and it's true that that Netflix's reach is much smaller than many other platforms that we talk about, YouTube and the like. But I think what Netflix has going in their favor is, I would bet that any kind of ad format that they allow onto their platform will be, it will keep their audience's attention better than a standard ad on another platform, right? So while they're certainly lower in terms of reach, they may be a little better in terms of the way they get their audience to stay engaged with the ads.
They might even be able to provide better data to their advertisers in some sense.
I would hope so, given that they're charging something like this, right? Because there's no advertiser I mean, you may see advertisers try this once,
Yeah.
right? But in the absence of data, it's not going to be more than once.
Yes. There's also another contradiction that occurred to me that Netflix has to resolve at some point, which is when they started off, because they were first to create this model.
Yep.
A lot of what they did was acquire content from big media companies who have now realized that they want to also get into the streaming game and have taken that content back. And then at that point, Netflix had already beaten that game and started creating a lot of originals, spending a lot of money, and that's now proven to be hard to sustain.
Yeah.
So in this era of originals are not everything, and big media has gotten, and big tech have both, big media has gotten into creating tech platforms and big tech has gotten into creating original content of their own, like Apple has. Netflix might hit upon a blind spot where they'll really have to figure out what to do.
I would certainly think so. And you're right. If you kind of look at the content we've seen on Netflix over the last couple of years, it's indexed more and more towards original content and further away from licensed content. But I wouldn't put it past them to be able to science that out.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Right? And figure out what works for them and what doesn't.
Sure.
And
I'm sure.
very quickly pull the plug on what's not cutting it.
Well, I remember the first time I ever got a Netflix subscription, and I've been a customer of theirs for probably a decade now, more than that.
I actually don't know anyone who's ever cut a Netflix subscription.
Yeah. And I'm looking forward both academically as well as a consumer to see how they tackle the next year or so.
100%, right? I think it's an interesting question for our listeners as well, right? Is this something that they see kind of taking off? Is it before its time? Is it a company entering the wrong business? Is it going to bomb completely?
Yeah. I spoke to someone who used to work at Netflix, and I asked them, what the internal sentiment is. He said, Reed Hastings always manages to figure it out. And they believe in him so much. He just said, I'm sure he will. He said every single time the market looked funny, he just threw something at it that nobody saw coming and just figured it out.
Yeah, it's a great company. They make a great product. Advertising is a proven business model.
Yeah.
Right. So in that sense, they have a lot of stars lining up for them. It's just a question of how well they do it.
Yeah. There was another story that broke this week from YouTube.
Yeah.
Neal Mohan, who used to be with the DoubleClick team and came from the acquisition and has been with YouTube, I think, 15 years, something like that, was on the Recode Media podcast, and he was talking about YouTube Shorts, and they've launched a new interesting monetization model. And this is for me an example of the kind of innovation that Netflix might do, or even more.
Yeah.
Mr. Beast, who is today the largest creator on YouTube, recently gave an interview where he talked about how he doesn't spend as much of his time on TikTok or Reels, because he said, I repurpose my content there because it's a useful way to create a funnel and get more reach, but monetization is very poor. And we know that Twitch and TikTok and Reels and everyone and Snapchat have all been trying to figure this one out. And YouTube has traditionally been the dearest friend of creators. They were the first platform for them. They put the spotlight on creators. They were the first one that launched monetization in a big way, enough for people to say they can have a sustainable career on YouTube. So YouTube Shorts, which is the equivalent of Reels or TikTok, has launched a new model where instead of the traditional YouTube long form, and I cannot believe that we're calling YouTube long form. I remember when YouTube launched, a 5-minute video was not long form. But the traditional YouTube long form way of monetization was, if you have a video, you can enable monetization if you hit a certain threshold in terms of subscribers or views or content. And then YouTube would show an ad against your video and then share the revenue with you, 55, 45, 45, 55, whichever way you want to look at it. With shorts, that's a little difficult because there is no video there is no ad associated with every single video.
Yeah.
You're scrolling through a feed and at some point you see an ad and then you scroll for some more time. And there are product placements and there are innovative ad spots. So YouTube's come up with a model where they are putting aside either a fixed or somewhat variable sum of money. And then any YouTube Shorts creator who crosses a certain threshold is now eligible for a share of that money. And the way the money is distributed is in the ratio of views. And it's done every now and then. Now, it's a model that I think just kills the need to attribute a specific ad to a specific video. And all you have to do is contribute to the entire platform in terms of views.
Yeah, it's an intelligent approach for YouTube to take, I think, right? Because clearly what they were doing for their long form videos wasn't going to work here, right? So it's always fun to see companies take a punt like this, right? I would say this is probably a relatively safe one. I can't see it backfiring very much for them. I'm curious to know how well their pool scales with the viewership of shorts as a whole.
Yeah.
Right? Because if it's a kind of fixed pool and viewership goes up over time, what you're going to see is creators get they might still have a large share of a pool, but the pool's effectively just going to get smaller and smaller over time. Yeah. So
they're also launching some interesting product enhancements because they don't want you to just be on YouTube for their shorts product. So they want to create the ability for a user to click through from a shorts video to a long
form video. Yeah, that makes sense.
And also give the creator to have the ability to monetize on both sides of YouTube. I love the interplay between all of these companies. I see it as licensed creative inspiration, whatever you want to call it, because everyone has to learn from each other, and what they're really uncovering is where consumers want to go.
Yeah.
I also found it interesting in some of the Netflix research I was doing, which is that Netflix has hired a bunch of folks from Snapchat to be able to drive their ads business.
Yeah, the thing is, it's such a small ecosystem. It's not. It's now tens or hundreds of thousands of people, but it feels like the people in the world who are experts at ads is just a very small group, and they keep going from YouTube to Facebook to Netflix to there's like maybe 5 or 10 large companies that they sort of circle through.
Yeah. Last couple of topics that we wanted to address today. You were telling me about Google Stadia.
Yeah. Google Stadia, the cloud game streaming service that Google launched, I want to say about 2.5 years ago. They announced last evening that they were pulling the plug on it and refunding the cost of all the hardware that customers had ever bought. Right? So it's a huge move for them. Right? It's a large cost, clearly, right? Because 2.5 years of customers buying hardware, I don't know what the number is, but it's not going to be small, right? For me, I have sort of mixed feelings about this. I was never really a Stadia user. I've experimented with it once or twice, but I love the idea of it when they first launched it, right? The idea that you would never need to really buy a game again, that you could just subscribe to it and never download anything, just stream everything straight onto your device and onto your TV, right? I thought at the time that it was going to make gaming really convenient, right? Because at the time, for me in India to get access to a new game was probably a matter of 2 days, order it from Amazon, wait for it to arrive, install it, and so on, right? And this kind of took away the need for any of that. It's a little sad that that YouTube has taken this decision, that Google has taken this decision. I think there were a lot of gamers and some game studios that reacted very sadly to this kind of news.
Yeah.
But
they're not taking this call because the model is not viable, right? They're just prioritizing.
They've taken this call because they never saw growth, right? And we've seen this with a number of Google products over the years, right?
Google Reader,
yeah. Their social media, Google Plus, right? They launched a product, they had it in the market for a couple of years, didn't work, they pulled the plug on it.
Google Glass,
right? I think they put out a very strong statement saying they've learned a lot through this process, right? And all the technology they've built to run Google Stadia is kind of going to be useful to them in many other businesses, including streaming, AR, VR, the metaverse, wherever that goes, right? So I don't think it's going to be a waste, right? But from a gamer point of view, from a consumer point of view, I think it left a lot of people disappointed.
I can imagine. I'm not a big gamer myself, but I do play. I have a PlayStation that I use, and for me, the biggest nightmare is buying new games, and I don't do it as often because it's quite taxing to do it.
It is. Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of stories in here. As we know, in the last 6 months, Sundar Pichai and Mark Zuckerberg have all been talking about tightening their belts.
Facebook announced just yesterday that they were going to be put on a hiring freeze for the rest
Hiring
of the year.
freeze and potential reconfiguration of the team.
And they did use the word tightening of belts in there somewhere.
Yeah. There was a podcast. I go back to this podcast I was listening to earlier this week by the Ken, where they interviewed Baskar, who's the CEO of Amagi. And he asked him a very interesting question. He said, how do you measure progress? What's your measure? And one of the metrics he used is, he said, I try and look at how often we kill a product. If a product has done its time and you don't have the ability to take it to the back of the shed and shoot it dead, he said, then you're really going to carry a lot of weight and debt because you're not being data driven. Sometimes a market can kill a product. Sometimes a product has done its time. And I think this is interesting because it is causing a lot of heartache, and they're going to have to live with it, but that's not new.
Yep. And one of the nuggets I kind of stumbled across on Twitter was that in the whole Google Stadia ecosystem, there are 5 games that don't exist on any other platform. So the sunsetting of Google Stadia means that there's 5 games that are just going to disappear from the world, unless their developers decide to port them to another platform or something, right? And I know there's a lot of very sentimental gamers out there that feel that even if these games aren't great, just like you have books archived in libraries and you have an archive of pretty much all the video that exists, there needs to be something like that for games.
I wanted to end with a small note about podcasts.
Yeah.
I'm very curious to know how. This is your first ever podcast.
Second, actually.
This is your second podcast. So I'm curious to know what these two have been like for you. But before that, I got started with podcasts because in 2014, Sushma, who's a dear friend of Kavita's and mine, introduced me to this podcast called Serial.
Right.
And I fell in love with it. I was listening to it everywhere. I would just sit on my couch and listen. I didn't need to commute. I didn't need to be on a walk to listen to a podcast. It was just a brand new format, and I just loved not looking at a screen and being told a story.
Yeah.
And Sarah Koenig and the entire Serial team did a spectacular job of telling a story. And Serial was in the news this week because the protagonist, or the focus of the first season, a gentleman named Adnan Syed, was released from prison this week. And the podcast had a huge part to play in his entire story, including everything that happened leading up to his release. And so they released another follow-on episode this week, which I went and listened to. And ever since then, I've gotten hooked onto podcasts. And ever since we started our podcast, I spend a significant portion of my time listening to podcasts, so much so that it has replaced some of the other forms of content I consume. So I was curious to know what your relationship is with podcasts.
Yeah, so I enjoy podcasts, and I kind of feel bad that I don't have the time I need to listen to all the podcasts I want to, right? So I end up listening to, I have a pretty tightly curated set of podcasts that I listen to. I don't really stray far from that very much. And yeah, it kind of becomes my listening on my commute to and from office, when I'm doing my exercise, stuff like that. But I wish I had more time to listen to podcasts, because there's a ton of great podcast content out there. It's also, I feel, a little easier than reading a book, right? Because while I love reading and most of my content is in the form of reading, I find podcasts to be a slightly less taxing, way to kind of pull information into my head. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hope to have you
I
on the
enjoyed
podcast.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And thank you all for listening. Have a great weekend, and bye-bye.